Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is Salim Akhtar Malik, your host at the Observation Post channel. On this channel, I discuss with you issues of national and international importance, defense and security matters, military technology, as well as important events from military history. Before I proceed further, I request you to please subscribe to my channel by clicking the bell icon. In this session, I'll be talking to you about how Israel steals military technology. Specifically, I'll talk to you about how Israel stole the blueprints of Mirage aircraft from France and Switzerland. And based upon those blueprints, then it developed its own version of Mirage aircraft. There is a well recorded history, well documented history of Israeli theft and stealing operations under the supervision of its intelligence agency, Mossad. These operations were carried out mostly during the 1960s till 1970s. These are still going on, but then Israel does not need to steal military technology anymore because it has got open access to military technology. During the recent years, America has opened its doors to give access to military technology to Israel. Similarly, the European countries also provide all sorts of technological know how and military technology to Israel. So it does not need to steal technology as well as military hardware and software from these countries. It did so mainly during the period between 1960s and 1970s. So when I said there is a well recorded and documented history of the Israeli theft and stealing operations, I would like to particularly mention the major espionage operations carried out by the Israelis to steal military technology. So in 1968, the Israelis, under the supervision of their intelligence agency Mossad, hijacked a ship loaded with 200 tons of raw uranium or yellow cake. They hijacked the ship on the high seas and then diverted it to Israel, where the raw uranium was used for the clandestine nuclear program, which Israel had initiated with the French help during the 1950s. Then in 1969, that is in December 1969, Israel hijacked 5 missile boats or missile ships from a French shipyard at Cherbourg, which is located on the English Channel coast. So they hijacked those 5 missile ships to Israel, where they were inducted in the Israeli Navy. And starting in the late 1960s and culminating somewhere in the 1970s, they stole Mirage aircraft blueprints as well as other forms of technology from France and Switzerland, upon which, as I said, they built their and developed their clone of Mirage aircraft, which was known as, initially it was known as Dagger or Nesher. and later on an improved version was called Kafir or Lion Cub. So prior to the 1967 war, France depended upon military hardware from Israel depended upon military supplies from France. And its armed forces, particularly its Air Force, was equipped with the state of the art French fighter plane Mirage 3. At that time, Mirage 3 was the one of the best fighter planes in the so-called free world. So they had this plane upon which they built their air force, and they used the Mirage aircraft, which was their workhorse during the 1967 war, to defeat the Arab air forces, which included the frontline air forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, as well as Iraq. So, as I said, they had made a plan which they called Plan Focus, which was evolved by the then Israeli Chief of Air Staff, Ezer Weizmann. According to that plan, they had built mock ups of the Egyptian airfields as well as the airfields of other countries, particularly Jordan and Syria. They had made the mock ups of the Arab airfields in Israel, in the Israeli desert known as Negev. It is located towards the south of Israel, in southern Israel. So on 5th May, they attacked the Arab air forces, with the airfields of the Arab air forces. They first started with the Egyptian air force, and as I said, they had built the mock-ups on which they were training as to how they would defeat the Arab air forces in the event of a war between Israel and the Arab countries. So they were well aware about the layout of the airfields of their enemies, the Arab enemies, and they launched their preemptive airstrike on the morning of 5th June 1967. They attacked, first they attacked the Egyptian airfields. There were 18 of those airfields which they attacked and destroyed not only the airfields but also 450 aircraft which were parked on the airfield, on the Egyptian airfields, and the Arabs were not prepared. The Egyptians had declared a state of emergency. They had blockaded the Gulf of Aqaba, which ignited the war between Israel and the Arab states, but they had not taken any defensive measures or protective measures to defend their or to protect their airfields. So there was no dispersion, there was no dispersal of aircraft, and the aircraft were standing on the Egyptian airfield. They were parked on the Egyptian airfields like civilian aircraft, and there were no worthwhile air defense measures. So Israel was able to defeat or destroy not only the Egyptian air force, but it also subsequently destroyed the Jordanian as well as the Syrian air forces. And thereafter, the Israeli ground offensive against the Arab states was just a walkover because it had already won the war through its air offensive. And in that air offensive, Mirage aircraft, which was of French origin, played an important role. So Israelis had received the French aircraft, which was Mirage 3, prior to the 1967 war, and they had built their air force around this aircraft. And thereafter, in May 1967, that is a month before the start of the 1967 war, they had asked the Israelis to improve or to evolve an improved version of Mirage 3, which would be subsequently known as Mirage 5. And in that, they had suggested certain changes in the design, armaments, and avionics of the aircraft, particularly to increase its range by removing the advanced avionics which were located initially in Mirage 3 towards the rear of the cockpit, equipping the aircraft with better guns as well as missiles and avionics. So French had started work on Mirage 5, and they had advanced quite a lot towards this direction. One aspect which I forgot to tell you was that during all the espionage operations in which the Israelis carried out thefts and stealing of military hardware, software, as well as military technology, the states on which territory these operations took place were in cahoots with the Israelis. They cooperated with the Israelis and feigned ignorance about the thefts and stealing operations. They let the Israelis get away with their objectives of stealing and thefts, and only after the Israelis had completed their mission and got away with what they had wanted would the states like France, Switzerland, etc., would raise hue and cry, raise alarm, and then shed crocodile tears. They would then take some eyewash measures such as dismissing some low level operatives and government functionaries whom they blamed for the Israeli operations. But then they were in connivance. All along, they had been in connivance with the Israelis. And they not only helped the Israelis in the stealing and theft operations, but also glorified their operations by projecting those operations, particularly in the Western media, as operations carried out by a small state like Israel against its large neighbors. And they justified those operations by saying that Israel was besieged by its Arab neighbors. So this happened during all the operations which the Israelis carried out to steal technology as well as military hardware and software from these countries. Talking about the stealing of Mirage aircraft blueprints, this was done in it started somewhere in 1968. Now, in 1968, the Israelis launched a commando operation against Beirut airfield in which they destroyed a number of civilian aircraft which were parked on the runways as well as on the apron of the Beirut International Airport. Now, they said that they had launched this operation because Lebanese territory was being used by the Palestine Liberation Organization for operations against Israel. And as a result of the Israeli commando operation, Charles de Gaulle, who was then the president of France, imposed an embargo on the delivery of 50 Mirage 5 aircraft. Now, the same Mirage aircraft which were developed to improve the performance of Mirage 3 aircraft. Israel, the French had developed those aircraft by 1968, and they were embargoed because of the Israeli commando operation against Beirut airport. Those were 50 aircraft which were embargoed. But again, as we see the duplicity of the French government, the embargoed aircraft were subsequently delivered to Israel in knockdown forms. That is, they were packed inside crates and they were delivered to Israel clandestinely, where they were assembled by Israeli technicians and inducted into Israeli Air Force. By that time, France had also provided the drawings of the jigs and fixtures as well as uh, those of the airframe, that is the Mirage 5 airframe to Israel, and they had started work somewhere in 1969 upon making Mirage 5 aircraft, that is the Israeli version of Mirage 5 aircraft, which would be based on the stealthily provided French technology as well as technology and blueprints stolen from Switzerland. Now, Switzerland was also at that time using Mirage aircraft, and it was even manufacturing the engines for those aircraft. And Israelis needed the technical know-how and the blueprints of the engines for the Mirage 5 aircraft. So they recruited an engineer at the Swiss defense facility, which was manufacturing the Atar engine for Mirage 5 aircraft at a Swiss facility. His name was Alfred Frauenknecht, and he provided them the blueprints of the engines, that is, the engines which were to power the Israeli made Mirage aircraft. Now, this French engineer, Alfred Frauenknecht, was responsible for destroying the blueprints of the engines the blueprints which were provided to Switzerland by France for the construction of a given number of engines for the aircraft of French Swiss Air Force. So his responsibility was that after all the engines had been produced or constructed, he would supervise the destruction of the blueprints, which he did not. And he provided 20 crates of the aircraft engine blueprints to the Israeli agents, who then smuggled those crates to Israel. And in place of the blueprints, he burnt some rough paper material and gave the certificate that he had burnt the blueprints. So French then correction, the Israelis then built their version of the Mirage 5 aircraft, fighter aircraft in Israel, and thereafter they inducted those aircraft in the Israeli Air Force, as well as exported those aircraft to a number of South American countries as well as Sri Lanka. But then, some years after the 1967 war, Israel had started receiving American equipment, and it did not need Mirage 5 aircraft or Mirage 3 aircraft as much as it did before the 1967 war. So the Mirage aircraft were replaced by Phantoms and Skyhawks which were produced in America, and Israel did not need, as I said, those Mirage aircraft as much as it did before the 1967 war. So it then gradually phased out the Mirages from its inventory and based its air force solely on the American aircraft, which it is doing even now. It not only has the largest F-16 fleet of aircraft outside of the United States, but also has received F-35, the latest version, the latest stealth aircraft from the United States. This is all I wanted to say in this session. See you in the next session with a new topic and with a new video. Till then, bye-bye.